Back in my car. I'm going to do one of these Ascension videos, just off the cuff. And this is just to kind of level set what I'm talking about, okay? So I love that Alex sent that graphic in the group chat that shows the problem that God is trying to solve with the atonement. Every atonement theory or model has a different problem that God is trying to solve, and it says something about the nature of reality, the nature of God. It says something about what it means, what salvation consists of. You know, like all the doctrines are related to each other. They're not separate from each other. Okay, and so, for example, if you believe in the penal substitution theory, which is the payment model I keep talking about, then you believe that the problem you're trying to solve is God's wrath. And so that says something about the nature of God, right? That you think that God has a element to him or a part of him or that's wrathful, right? That just is that way. And so you have to solve that somehow. And then you're also saying that can be solved by God punishing the Son in your behalf. And that says something about how the universe works, right? It means that, and in that version, it's God who makes that rule up in that version. That's why this is why I have such a hard time with it, and I don't mean to criticize anyone who thinks it believes it. As I said before, if it works for you, great. But if God made up the rule, that's a really arbitrary rule. It doesn't make sense. It's not just. It really isn't. It doesn't conform to any ideas of justice that we have in any other context. None of us think that punishing someone else in your behalf, especially an innocent victim, is just or would satisfy justice. And then why would that stop you from being angry? It doesn't work. For me, it doesn't work. It doesn't have it. But anyway, so it paints a picture of the universe, how it works, who God is, and how he works. That and I'm obviously emphasizing the negative aspects of it. If you were to go look up the theologians that support that theory, they would defend it much better than I am. And so I don't mean to straw man it, as they say, make a straw man out of that model, which is kind of what I'm doing. I'm not being completely fair, and the reason why is because it's personal for me, right? It's hard for me to be fair about it because because it doesn't work for me. It actually pushes me away from God. So that's why I can't do it. Someone else who's more partial to it can give it a better defense. But on the other side, if it's not an angry God that has to be satisfied, if it's the fallen nature of humanity or the fallen nature of the world that has to be fixed, basically the world is sick. Like when J.R.R. Tolkien, The Lord of the Rings, opens up the movie, there's a 10-minute prologue where Galadriel talks about, there's basically a sickness. She doesn't use the word sickness, I don't think, but it's almost something like a sickness in the air. You can, it's in the water, it's in the air we breathe, it's in the, in the earth or whatever, which is why the elves are leaving Middle Earth, is because there's an infection. The world has been infected, and elves can't live in that infected world. They have to go to the blessed realms. Tolkien obviously is, very Christian. He's a Catholic, and so, he's getting these ideas. This is the fall. I mean, that's what Tolkien is describing, is the fall. And he actually says this. The elves in his story are Adam and Eve before they fell from the garden. They're magical, basically. they live forever, and they wanted their rings. I know this is a long digression, but it'll help explain it actually. They wanted their rings because the rings would help them preserve the lands they dwelled in, like a Garden of Eden. That's why if you watch those movies, like where Elrond lives and Galadriel lives, they're like little miniature gardens of Eden that and it's being preserved by the power of their rings. And that was the promise. That's how Sauron was able to deceive everyone. He's basically promising salvation. He was basically promising, like, you'll be able to, defeat the fall. And the fall had happened because Sauron is like evil guy number 2 in Tolkien's world. There was a guy before him called Morgoth. And like when Gandalf fights the Balrog, they call it the Balrog of Morgoth, So it's like Morgoth is like actually the devil in Lord of the Rings, and Sauron is like, the next devil down. Anyway, so the first devil, Morgoth, like infected the world with all of his malice and all of his, just like Sauron poured all of his malice into the ring, Morgoth poured his malice into the earth. And in fact, Tolkien has a book called Morgoth's Ring. It never was published, but he wrote it. And Morgoth's ring is the earth. So that helps explain, like, the ring of power is actually like a concentrated piece of the fall, you could say, of like evil and corruption at its finest. And that's what it does. When you put it on, you become a ring wraith, right? You become corrupted in your being. And or like Gollum, you transform into like a being, and those kinds of, and the point, now I'm using this as an example to say, if you become a ring wraith, you don't enjoy the things you used to enjoy. You're like dead to spiritual things. You're spiritually dead, right? Like, when Frodo puts the ring on and he kind of enters in that weird realm and he sees the race and they look like emaciated skeletons, and they're like, can't feel anything anymore or touch anything anymore. I mean, they're like basically just living in this realm between living and dead. That's the way Tolkien's trying to describe spiritual death. Okay, that's what he's doing. And Gollum is going in that direction. So is Frodo, the more he wears the ring as he's going to Mount Doom. So that's the problem. So like in the recapitulation model that Alex sent over, that graphic he sent over, that's if that's the problem, if like the fall means you start to become a ring wraith or Gollum or whatever, you're spiritually dead, then that's a different problem. God isn't necessarily angry with you, but he has to figure out a way to like cure you of your malady, right? And how do you do that when you're way up here above everyone and they're way down here? And I'm speaking not in terms of necessarily geographic space, like I'm talking about in terms of light and truth and glory and awesomeness and everything. And then we're basically like ring wraiths, right? Because of the fall, we're dead on the inside and whatever. Our hearts are hardened and all are fallen and are lost, right? So how do you solve for that problem? And the point I'm trying to make is that God himself, Jesus Christ, has to come down into the world, like, and bring the power of godliness, because there's a gulf now between us. He has to bring the power of godliness into this world in a form that can like fit, that doesn't overwhelm it, it doesn't destroy it. Okay? And I use analogies like, from physics or whatever, because I think like electricity is a great way of thinking about this, right? Just from an analogy point of view, it's like some things can conduct electricity and some things cannot conduct electricity, and then there are some things that can do both, and they're called semiconductors. That's actually, I used to work for Intel, and that's what Intel does, is they make semiconductors. They make something, it's a thing that both conducts and does not conduct electricity. And because of that, it's able to manipulate electricity and other things, like atomic level stuff, so that you and I can use it actually. Like if you just have an uninterrupted flow of electricity or atomic information, you and I can't decipher it. We don't have the capability of deciphering it. Like we don't have the mechanism. Like I said on a video the other day to a friend, we should think of ourselves as we're like Urim and Thummim, but we're not very good ones. Like our ability to translate the world around us is limited. We're constantly receiving information through our eyes, our ears, our nose, our skin, our touch, or our spirits, or whatever. We're all constantly receiving information, and we're translating it and interpreting it all the time, but we're not very good at it, and we miss a lot of the information out there. We can only focus on so much of it at a time. Like we just don't have the ability, like literally don't have the ability to pick up every light wave or every sound wave or every whatever, like we just can't. We're not capable of it. There's some things you don't feel, right? Your skin feels some things and doesn't feel other things. And that's true of our spirits, okay? Because of the condition we're in, because of the fallen world we're in, because we're in this like borderland between life and death, because we're like almost ring race in a sense because of the fall, okay? And so you have to package heaven, the glory of God, so that it can come to our level and communicate with us. And that's what a semiconductor does in the world of electronics and everything, is that it actually interrupts the flow of electricity so that it can come out in ones and zeros, and you and I can like use ones and zeros to create a language, a computing language that transmits information to us. And the semiconductors like turn the electricity on and turn it off, turn it on, turn it off. And it can do that because of its unique nature to both conduct and not conduct electricity. And then you and I can like now interpret that as information. So that's what Jesus is doing. He's like a semiconductor. He can both conduct God's light and glory into our lives and turn it off, temper it, turn it off, whatever you want to call it, in such a way that it's now becomes intelligible for you and I. It becomes, you and I can actually feel it now, and it's a part of us now. And so that's all these things I'm talking about like Christ breathing the breath of life into the world, or touching us with his light and glory. That's what I'm just using. That's the same idea. It's like he's lit us up just a little bit. He's just given us a dose so that we can like hear his message while we're in this fallen state, okay? But the ascension piece is so that's the descension piece, and the ascension piece is he has to go up. He wants us not to stay fallen forever. We have to go up, right? So I'm going to keep talking about that in a minute, but I just wanted to clarify that the fall, like you might say, then why are we even doing this? See, the point is though, is that you and I used to live in heaven. We used to not be fallen beings and corrupt beings. And in order to really learn, we had to be like basically become the opposite. Like we had to become it. See, that's the problem, is like the opposition we had to experience in this life has to become a part of us. That's why, I love that analogy of, Adam and Eve eat the fruit, because the food you eat becomes a part of you. So whatever that fruit was, it's death, basically, it's corruption, it's fallenness. When they ate it, then that corruption, that death, that fallenness became a part of their being. And it had to happen, because that's the only way you and I would experience the opposition we needed to experience. And the whole world is fallen now too. Everything's saturated with it, right? The prince of the power of the air, as I was mentioning before, everything's saturated. Or as Galadriel says at the beginning of the Lord of the Rings, like you can feel it in the water and in the air and everything. It's like everywhere. It's in your skin and in your bones, right? It's there. And that had to happen though, because that's how you and I experience the opposition that we need. The opposite of our heavenly life before we came here, so that we could learn and grow. You're not going to learn and grow if you're a Garden of Eden being. Like Adam and Eve before the fall, I'm making this point because I love C.S. Lewis, but he argued you didn't need the fall because just the temptation alone in the garden was enough for them to learn the lesson they needed to learn. C.S. Lewis, everyone recognizes that you need some kind of opposition in order to learn and grow. And C.S. Lewis recognized this, and so he said, they were already experiencing the opposition they needed, though. They were in the garden, and there was a tree of death, basically, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. If they had just resisted it, they would have learned the lessons they needed to learn. And he makes a good point, because you learn. You don't have to commit sin in order to learn. You can just resist the sin and learn. But the reason why this is where I disagree with C.S. Lewis, as much as it pains me to say it, because I really love C.S. Lewis. The reason why I think he's wrong is because there is a difference. If your body is not corrupted, like if you're basically an elf from Lord of the Rings living in the Garden of Eden, right? Like you are magical in a sense. You have not fallen yet, and your body is filled with spirit instead of blood, and it's coursing through your veins. It's like electricity coursing through your veins. Like, I'll use another example, Thor from Marvel, right? And he feels the electricity pumping through his veins. That's the kind of beings we used to be before the fall, okay? And resisting temptation with that kind of body is different than resisting temptation with this body. And that's the point, is like, to really learn the lesson, to really understand the opposite of heaven, you and I had to become the opposite of heaven. Like, not just have it tempt us from out there somewhere, from, exterior to me. I had to really learn the lesson. Like, the opposite of heaven had to become a part of who I was, because now I feel it every day. And now every choice I make towards heaven is totally different too, if you think about it. Like, if you have electricity or spirit coursing through your veins, and you're like a magical elf being, basically, just using these as analogies, guys. I don't, just to help you understand that there was a huge difference. If you're that kind of being, making the choice to do good is much, what are you getting? There's no lesson learned there almost. Like, you're already doing what's in your nature, because it's coursing through your veins. Like, light and truth is already coursing through you. You're just doing what your nature is. Now the natural man is an enemy to God. And so to choose God when the natural man is an enemy to God is a huge deal. That is a real test. And that is why there's growth, is because your nature has become fallen and you are an enemy to God by nature. And so then you have to choose. So then when Christ blows the breath of life back into you through the atonement, or like touches you with a little bit of his light, so there's it's glowing inside of you at least a little bit, and now you have both a divine nature. You can both sense your divine nature and sense your fallen nature inside of you at the same time. Now when you choose the light, it's a big deal. You're like overcoming stuff. You're not just doing what your nature suggested you should do. You're actually overcoming the bad. You're actually overcoming the fall. You're actually overcoming, whatever. It's like the same thing as if overcoming anything makes you stronger, makes you better, increases your capacity, increases your ability to choose and to think and to use your judgment, all that stuff. And really what we're learning to do, this is the key thing, you guys, is that because the source of life is God, right? And the source of all this is God, and being aligned with God and abiding in his presence, abiding in his spirit and his glory. Like, if I can do that, if I can learn to do that while my nature is fallen, then nothing will ever stop that in the future. You see, like that's the habit we're trying to create, is I have this tug and pull of fallenness, and then Christ has lit me up a little bit with his light. And if I give myself to that light over and over and over again throughout my whole life, I am creating like a capacity, a strength in my spirit, in my mind, that says, no matter what happens, no matter how I feel, I am choosing faith. I'm choosing the light. I'm choosing Christ. I'm developing capacities I didn't have before, or that I couldn't have possibly developed before, because I didn't have this kind of test before. And that's actually the test, is can I learn to choose God and his light and his glory, no matter the environment, no matter the situation? And if I can, then I will overcome all things. Then sin and death will be nothing. And again, it's not because I'm great necessarily. It's because of Christ, his greatness. But, and this gets back to your theories of salvation and stuff, if the point is to appease the wrath of an angry God, then usually where you land in terms of salvation, like what is required for salvation, is something like saved by grace with no works, and or by faith alone kind of thing, because the debt has already been paid and there's nothing else to do, and you're not changing your nature, you're just changing God's disposition towards you. You see, and so if Christ changed God's disposition towards you, there's nothing left to be done other than just accept that fact. Do you see the connection between what is the nature of God, what kind of atonement needs to be done based on the nature of God, and what does that mean for humans and what they need to do to be saved? There's a connection with all that. And so if you believe that, then you usually land, and this is why the doctrine of usually on a faith alone or grace alone kind of thing, and that's what this doctrine, the penal substitution doctrine, actually was developed by Martin Luther and John Calvin. You see, that's historically speaking. It didn't really, Anselm in the 8th century kind of created, it's another satisfaction theory, but it's different. And then maybe in another video I can go into Anselm, because it's already 20 minutes long and I got things I need to do. But my point is like this true penal substitution theory arose with Martin Luther and John Calvin. And I would say that the reason why they started to go down that path was because they had decided the Catholic Church was corrupt and fallen, and so if the Catholic Church can't provide salvation through its sacraments and through the power and authority given to the Catholic Church, then what are you going to do? You still need salvation. And so Martin Luther and John Calvin focus on the scriptures that talk about faith and grace and say that's it, that's sufficient. So you don't need a church anymore. You actually eliminate the need of a church. You eliminate the need of like I said, it's more of an imputation of salvation, God declaring you righteous rather than you becoming righteous, because the problem to be solved is God's wrath, not your fallenness or whatever. Now that's overly simplistic, because Martin Luther and John Calvin also held to a doctrine of sanctification, but in any event, that's kind of the idea, okay? And the point I'm making is that if the primary problem is not God's wrath, but our fallenness or corruption, our ring wraith-like status, then salvation is Christ coming down to us and trying to lift us up to transform us into something new. But our participation is required, okay? And actually, you need a church. Like you need a mechanism. And that's what I'm trying to show you guys right now through this Ascension thing, is there's a mechanism, like a whole structure that Christ will build out so that from his base of operations in heaven, he can continue to filter grace, because we need the grace and sanctifying power and everything to pull us upwards. And so like these doctrines aren't just theoretical, is what I'm getting at. They have practical implications. They have practical implications for why a church is necessary, or what is the relationship of grace and works. Those kinds of questions come from your understanding of God's nature and your understanding of what the atonement means, or what the atonement is. They really do. It changes everything, okay? And also what our nature is. And I'll get into that more maybe in the next couple of videos, but the point I want to make is I think we're saved by grace, what we're doing is we're just choosing the light that Christ has put in us, or the breath that he's put in us. And that, by doing that, it strengthens our capacity to become more and more like him and to receive more and more. So your agency matters, because it's required. So there's a works element, you could say, but you don't increase or improve because you did it. You increase or improve because you let him do it. See that? Does that make sense? Like you're allowing him to increase you by letting him in, and by choosing him over and over and over again. All right, so this is kind of off the cuff. I was just thinking about it because I'm going to get into the Hebrews and then book of Revelation on the Ascension, and in Moroni and the Book of Mormon and stuff. And I'm going to try to tie some of these concepts together so you can see why it's so important that there's a descension and an ascension, and that Christ's goal is to transform us, and that Christ's goal is the same as the Father's. He came to do the will of the Father. So the Father isn't like an angry God. Okay, but then you'd say, well, Cameron, what about all those scriptures that talk about the justice of God or God's judgment and stuff? And that's why I emphasize his glories, because God, his will might be, I want to help you, but at the same time, it could be, but I also have to be this glorious being that sustains all things. And so, in order to help you, I have to come up with some kind of workaround. And if you're not ready to come back into my presence, then you will perceive my presence as oppressive. That's what I keep trying to say, and I think that's actually ultimately what our scriptures teach. But then our human language slips back into, divine wrath or payment and stuff like that. But, every now and then you get these scriptures like in Mormon chapter 9, where Moroni is like, you wouldn't even want to dwell with God if you're unclean. Like, you don't want to be there. And that is the problem. See, that's an us problem, not a God problem. Although, and you could say, why doesn't God just, make it so I can do whatever I want and it'll be okay? Well, because then you're ignoring realities. Like, God has to be a certain kind of being to sustain the universe. That's what the Book of Mormon says when it says, if God weren't just, then he would cease to be God. And if God ceases to be God, then everything falls apart. That's the point C.S. Lewis made in the Chronicles of Narnia, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, when he was like, if you don't do this, if we don't honor this, then like the deep magic that made the world will fall apart. And that's what I'm trying to say. There's like, the justice of God isn't, don't use the courtroom metaphor, use the creation metaphor. The justice of God is the order and the rules and the laws that are poured into the fabric of the universe. And if you don't honor them, then the fabric of the universe tears apart. That's the idea. And if it tears apart, then you can't have life. You can't have being. You can't have all the goodness. So you can't, if you deny justice, you deny like the basis of reality. And the basis of like choices and agency, it all falls apart without it. So like, you don't want God to be unjust. Actually, you want him to be just because it sustains life. Then it's like, how do you make it work though? Well, we're not really ready for the fullness of his life, and that's the atonement. See, I'm trying to reframe it. So hopefully I'm helping, and maybe I'm repeating myself some, but I feel like these are hard concepts. I mean, guys, the reason why I'm doing this is because it literally took me like 25 years to get to this point. And so I repeat it because as I say it, I feel like I'm working against hundreds of years of cultural indoctrination. Whether we know it or not, we're all kind of Protestants by nature. We're all kind of disciples of Martin Luther and John Calvin. Regardless of whether you want it to be that way or not, their ideas permeate our lives. And some of their ideas, I'm thankful for Martin Luther and John Calvin. Just, I'm actually thankful for like every one of these people I ever bring up. I did a paper on Martin Luther in college. I love Martin Luther. Like, I really do. I'm almost getting emotional thinking about it. Like, I do. I'm so grateful for him. I'm grateful for John Calvin. I'm grateful for all these people who came before and did the very best they could. And they did, in so many ways, they did so many good things. And so when I am critiquing, I'm just, I'm doing it with all the love, and I'm doing it on just certain things, right? And so for good and bad, we live in the world. In the Martin Luther and John Calvin, they spoke out into the world. They breathed their ideas out into the world, and now it's part of the air that we breathe, the culture that we're a part of, and we just soak it in, and we think the thoughts that they've thought, many of them. And one of those thoughts is the penal substitution theory of the atonement, which is the way almost all of us by default interpret the atonement. And I'm trying to help you see that the scriptures actually talk about it in significantly different ways, in my opinion. And it takes time because I'm working against hundreds of years of cultural indoctrination. It took me 25 years because I was working against cultural indoctrination, and I was afraid that every time I got a little bit of light, I was afraid that if I went down that path and I was leaving behind the words and everything that everybody always had said, that I was somehow gonna end up out in some weird spot and out of the church and out of Christ's love and rejecting Christ. I was afraid to follow the promptings because the cultural norms were pulling me back the other way, and that was more comfortable, and that's what everybody else thought, right? That's how everybody else talks about it. And that's why it took me 25 years, you guys, is because it takes a long time to get comfortable letting go of the traditions of your fathers. Even if those traditions aren't always absolutely right or correct. That's why it takes so long for this stuff. It's hard for us to let it go. Joseph Smith used to talk about this, that anything he would try to teach something against that kind of contradicted some tradition that everyone had, and then everybody would fall to pieces over it because it was like contradicting how they used to do it, how they used to think about it, how they used to whatever. And it's so hard. It just is. It's so hard to make that transition. So anyway, that's why I keep harping on it. And I hope that as I speak about it, I keep harping on it because I'm trying to do that, but I also am trying to find the right words. It's so hard to articulate what I'm trying to say. Every word I say feels like it's not good enough. Every time I say something, it feels like I'm failing to capture the true wonder and splendor of it all, which is why I refer back to things like Marvel Comics or the Lord of the Rings and stuff like that, is because those stories have these images that kind of capture ideas way better than I can say them. And I worry when I bring those up that I'm undermining my own credibility, because it's like, you're using Thor, like Marvel to make this point. Peter Parker disintegrating into dust, whatever. I use that one all the time. And I understand that. I just hope that you'll understand like what I'm trying to do with those points, and that it's just because sometimes it's helpful to have like an image in your mind to be able to process what I'm getting at. In fact, the scriptures say all the time, like, behold. In fact, there's this, oh boy, we'll get into this once I get off this Ascension thing. We get back to the Old Testament. But there are so many times where it says the word of the Lord appeared to so-and-so in the Old Testament. Wait a second, the word of the Lord appeared? Why isn't it the word of the Lord was heard? Okay? And there's a couple things behind that. There's one that it's the word of the Lord is Jesus, because he is the word. And so when he appeared and when it says like Abraham 15, I think is one of those examples where it says the word of the Lord appeared. He's seen Jesus Christ. So, and there's a whole tradition behind that. Like John didn't just all of a sudden out of the blue call Jesus the Word of God. There's like a whole tradition that he was drawing on that was kind of like an oral tradition, a background tradition that was kind of in the apocryphal texts and in different things that he was drawing on. So anyway, the other thing about it is that I think we're meant to behold, meaning imagine the scriptures, imagine what it's talking about, because it makes it more vivid, it makes it more real rather than just like reading, So behold, try to behold stuff. And that's why I give you guys those images. So, all right. That's enough for now. Talk later.